Hello, and welcome to my Student Impact Study. My name is Brianna Spangler, and today I'll be discussing with you some of the research that I found specifically for my impact study and how I took strategies to incorporate and implement into my classroom instruction. Before I begin, I think it's important that you know I worked with a group of third graders at East Salisbury Elementary School. Based on my mentor teacher's SLO, I came up with an academic problem and an academic goal. The academic problem was that after evaluating the pre-assessment given to the students, we found that students lack written expression, specifically within narrative writing. Our goal, myself and my mentor teacher's goal, was for students to improve their written expression within narrative writing. Some academic resources that were used specifically to help and implement some strategies was the IRIS case study. The specifics of this case study was it provided different writing strategies to incorporate into the classroom. When I was reading through the IRIS case study, I found that graphic organizers help students possess these prerequisite skills, things that if we continue to implement these graphic organizers, it'll reinforce the things that they have learned specifically within narratives. I focused mainly on the C-SPACE strategy. The C-SPACE strategy stands for character, setting, purpose, action, conclusion, and emotions. This strategy helps ensure that all those narrative elements that need to be in their narratives are included. The other academic resource that I used was Roberta Purba's article, which discusses the implementation of discussion starter story technique. This approach gives students the opportunity to develop an inventive story that includes emotion, as well as it allows the students to write with expression. My last resource is from Jennifer Saravallo's The Writing Strategies book. I specifically would recommend this book to any educator who specifically wants to improve their writing in their classroom. Jennifer Saravallo, she provides teachers with strategies to implement into instruction and some of their small groups. Strategies within this book, they provide a task or activity that directly relates to a specific goal. In my case, I'm working with narrative writing, so I specifically looked for tasks and activities that would implement those narrative elements. I mainly focused on the elements such as character development, setting, dialogue, and emotion within some of the activities and tasks that I wanted the students to practice. My baseline evidence and data analysis. If you look at this chart right here, you'll see that I worked with a total of 6 students. I first gave my pre-assessment to 44 students because our school was departmentalized. The data was found using the PARCC scoring rubric for prose constructed response items narrative task. The highest score students can achieve for both written expression and language conventions is 3 points. After speaking with the reading coach at East Salisbury, she was mentioning to me that what they do with the score is they'll multiply it and they'll double that score. As you can see, I have my 6 students, written expression, and language conventions. Specifically, if you're focusing on written expression, you'll see that 83.3% of students scored a 1. 16% of students scored a 2. And that was specifically within written expression. None of my students that I worked with, students 1 through 6, none of them fully got a 3 on their narratives. If you look at their language and conventions, however, you'll see that 33% of students scored a 3, 50% of students scored a 2, and 16.6% of students scored a 1. When I went to pull out my 6 students that I wanted to work with, I realized that because I was focusing mainly on written expression, I wanted to work with those students whose language conventions had been developed enough that I only had to improve it by about 1 point. Written expression, however, because my goal and my problem area was they lacked written expression, I wanted that to be lower. And because I know that their language conventions was more developed, it would be an easier task for me to work with those students since they already have that development within language conventions. Data shows that students lack in written expression, and over 80% of students have some command of language and conventions. So that's what I was talking about there when it came within the chart. This is the reason why I chose these specific students. Students' baseline evidence, this is the first part. As you can see, we have my SIS or Student Impact Study Student 1, 2, and 3. If you look at it, I have a WE for written expression and an LC for language conventions. This was my pre-assessment, and with my pre-assessment, we were reading the one and only Ivan for our county, and specifically, if you look at it, the students were to write a first-person narrative told from Ivan's point of view. The narrative story was supposed to describe Ruby's arrival from the point of view of Stella, emphasizing her thoughts, feelings about Ruby, the domain, and Ivan. I discussed with the students what the word emphasizing meant, and we pulled out through the prompt so that they understood what specifically they were doing for our narrative task. So this was SIS students 1, 2, and 3. And then here is students 4, 5, and 6. And as you can see, from starting with student 1 to going to student 6 had one of my lowest scores. And what you see here is you notice that it's very short. It's not as developed compared to other students within my study. The student population, some number of students targeted were 6. Total number of students in the class, there were 41. Percentage of students targeted, I targeted 15% of students, and the targeted student population consists of students who performed a score of 1 or 2 points on the grade 3 PARCC scoring rubric for prose, constructive response items, and narrative tasks. The learning content specifically focused on the writing standard, where it says write narratives to develop real or imagined experiences or events using effective technique while chosen details and well-structured event sequences. This standard is targeted because the data from their writing diagnostic in 2017 showed that 4.66% of students met or exceeded the standard. Their pre-assessments, of course, showed lack of written expression when writing a narrative task, so that is why I specifically am focusing on that problem. The instructional interval, this is just telling you what time interval that I was working with the students. I began this SIS with the students on February 14th, and I plan to finish, as well as I did finish, on March 23rd, 2018. My plan of action, this is basically showing you what steps I took to implement these strategies. So each day the students were to answer daily questions, specifically in regard to the one and only Ivan novel and text from the anthology. I gave the students during their journal rotation a journal prompt, and this was to help increase that written expression. We practiced story starters, specifically how can they use weather, dialogue, action, sound, and question to hook their reader. I also felt it was important that the students understood how to use descriptive writing, how to write descriptively. I wanted them to understand how adjectives can be used in their writing. Then, as you can see over here, this is where I'm really bringing in the C-space strategy. It says C-spaced for a reason. With the graphic organizer, we know C stands for character, and I specifically found a strategy through the Writing Strategies book called External Character Description, and this just helped them describe what their character looks like from the outside. You then have setting, where the students were to create a scene that explored a specific setting that their characters would be taking place. I used this organizer and I helped them produce part of their post-assessment, because what happened is after we went through the organizer, I allowed the students to continue using this to plan out what they were going to write for their post-assessment. Purpose, just saying what was the purpose of the story, who was involved. You have the action, what actions were taken to help solve any problems that there were. Conclusion, how's the story going to end? What ended up happening? What was the result of the action? And then E stood for emotion. So specifically for emotion, I wanted the students to understand internal and external feelings. After focusing on emotion, I realized when evaluating my pre-assessment, students lacked discussion and communication or some form of dialogue between characters in their story. So I found an activity from the Writing Strategies book called Dialogue Tags, where the students came up with their own dialogue as well as they learned where to place quotation marks, which was very important. These are some of the samples from the plan of action. At first, what I had the students do was I had them tell me about a time they felt scared. They wrote whatever, however long they wanted to. Specifically, I gave them a 5-minute time limit to see what they could come up with within that time. This wasn't to be graded. This wasn't for the students to feel pressure. This was just for me to understand what they know how to do. I also gave journal prompts, as you can see over here. What would happen if you woke up one morning with wings? And I wanted them to tell me a story explaining what happened. This over here was a little bit of our dialogue tags, how they came up with their own specific dialogue for their stories that I specifically wanted them to pull at least 2 or 3 portions of dialogue that they came up with and implement it into their post-assessment. The inside story just discussed some feelings that the students wanted their characters to feel, specifically the baby elephants and the adult elephant that were coming along within our post-assessment. And they took these feelings and I wanted them to think about, well, if this is how they feel, what are they actually like thinking? What are those thoughts that they have? These are a few others that we had. Here are a few more samples from the action plan, specifically what I took from my student samples. Again, we have our inside story, our character development, dialogue tags, just working with quotation marks. Evidence of growth. I decided that growth was going to be acknowledged by the student's performance from their pre-assessment to their post-assessments. I also decided that in order for them to show growth, that they needed to increase their scores by 1 point based on the PARCC rubric. Again, the growth target was they need to increase their scores by 1 point on the rubric given by PARCC, specifically for narrative task. This is my target attainment. To reach full attainment, I specifically focused on my goal, which was 80% or more of the students are going to show that growth or meet the achievement target. 60% and between 60% and 80% of my students, I hope, will reach partial attainment, and then 60% or less of students will show insufficient attainment with meeting that target goal. This was the data that I collected after implementing the action plan. I found that 100% of the students increased their score by that 1 score point, so 100% of them met full attainment. Then we had 83% of students receiving the same score in language conventions compared to the baseline data. I said 16.6% of students improved their scores by 1 point in language conventions. This was my post-assessment. Most of my students wrote more than 1 page, specifically about 2 to 3 pages, which was excellent. This is students 4, 5, and 6. For digging deeper, I focused on students 3 and 4, their pre-assessment and post-assessment, and I compared their written expression and language conventions. I found that they increased by about 1 point each. This was their data graph. And thank you. I really do appreciate you joining me in my student impact study.